I have a hard time getting to a mountain and getting back into bed at night. And they would stay up until the sun went down, tried to go down the mountains by candlelight so that they could be ready the next morning to do it all over again. They loved it.
From NCPR, welcome to Northwards. People, ideas, and conversations from and about Northern New York, Vermont, and beyond. I'm Mitch Teich.
Support for the Northwards podcast comes from the J.C. Steiniger and M.E. McDonald Charitable Fund at Adirondack Foundation, in support of the Adirondack Foundation, building stronger Adirondack communities.
Hey, Ethan. Ethan Shanty, our producer here on Northwards, is with me in the studio, as he sometimes or often is. Are
Can
you
I say hello?
Yeah, you could say hello.
Hello.
Are you a 46er?
I'm like a tour, I think. Yeah, maybe I've got 2 high peaks under. I don't even know if they're high peaks, but I've climbed maybe 10 mountains in my whole life. Is that a lot?
That's not bad.
Oh, okay. Then I've climbed some mountains. I wouldn't say that I have loved it, though.
Well, and I was something of a hiker when I lived in northern Arizona, and there were mountains all around us. And in fact, the tallest mountain in Arizona was just outside of Flagstaff, where I lived. I never actually hiked to the top of it, though I did take a chairlift most of the way to the top once.
I didn't climb it, but I thought about climbing it, and that was exhausting enough.
Exactly right. I get so tired just thinking about well, and then there's the question, are you climbing a mountain or are you hiking a mountain? Because I think when you think of climbing a mountain, you think of Everest or K2 or one of those things with grappling hooks and stuff.
Yeah, you have to put the hooks into the rock face and stuff. Yeah, no, I've not done anything like that. I've walked up a mountain and sweated a lot on the way to get to the top.
I know many climbing words. There's belay. I'm not sure what it means exactly. And
I heard that in a movie, and I think I saw them belaying. But I don't know. Maybe
and then there's crampons, which
on your feet, right?
Yes, they go on your feet. Although it's a weird word, isn't it?
How about camelback? That's a word we both know.
That's true, yeah. From Arizona, and from the thing that people
the water pack.
Yeah.
Is Cathedral Rock a mountain, or is
I
it just
believe Cathedral? Well, it's a rock.
What's a rock? Well, aren't all mountains kind of rocks? Anyway, I climbed that in Arizona.
And I've hiked Camelback before, which is outside Scottsdale.
I was just thinking it was the water pack, but okay, so we're getting somewhere. We collectively know a lot about hiking. Okay, no, we don't. We're pretty much a minority certainly in this radio station. I would say that most of our colleagues really enjoy hiking, and it's not that I don't like it. It's just like I'm not in the best shape. My skin is really pasty and I'm pale, and so
I would climb that mountain, but I'm afraid of getting sunburned.
Yeah, and then the
air is so thin up there.
The air is so thin, and then I worry about ticks and bugs and stuff. I just can't get out of my own head. That being said, I really do appreciate the view when there is a view, because sometimes anyone who's listening will know that sometimes when you hike and there is a crappy view, but often it's really beautiful and it's worth the exhaustion and all of the energy that you've exerted. But as I get older, it's just it's not something that I prioritize. My partner really loves hiking. She hasn't had a whole lot of time to do it lately either, which is kind of good for me because it means that I don't get roped into hikes that I don't want to do. But, I wish I were in better shape, because I probably would enjoy it more because the views are stunning.
Well, and as we're having this conversation, I'm 6 months out from breaking my ankle in 3 places. Right. So hiking for me right now is taking my 2 dogs for a walk on Leroy Street in Potsdam, which is pretty flat.
Or braving the stairs up to the 2nd floor for the radio station.
Yeah, exactly. So even if I wanted to be an avid hiker right now, it's a ways out, and maybe that's something to aspire to. But right now, the great outdoors for me is once the weather gets a little better, sitting outside with my coffee.
I do enjoy taking a nice walk when the weather is perfect. But I told myself as the snow started to fall, I really want to go on walks even when the weather is bad. And so far, I've done that 0 times.
You should get dogs.
No.
You don't really have a choice.
Anyway, so the reason we're having this conversation is because you had a great conversation about some folks who did quite a bit of hiking on their own for the betterment of our region.
That is absolutely right. Verplanck, Colvin, and Mills Blake are 2 somewhat unsung heroes of the region. They were the people that did the first surveys of the peaks of the Adirondacks back in the 19th century, when the state was kind of interested. Hey, we've got this big area that nobody lives in, and we probably ought to know a little bit more about it. They basically talked the state into letting them go and survey the Adirondacks.
Right, because they didn't have a whole lot of the requisite experience that you would think that a surveyor might have. And along the way, they kind of had to invent quite a few tools in order to make their jobs like doable, as far as I understand it.
I don't want to say they were making it up as they were going along, because they were obviously building on the way people did surveying, but they really did had to do some improvising as they went along. And their work is still really relevant today, especially, I think, if you're a 46er or just somebody who likes to hike in the the high peaks. In fact, you can find some evidence of those original surveys if you know where to look, or you're extremely lucky. I was extremely lucky to get to have a conversation with a guy that knows Colvin and Blake's work really well, a guy named Thatcher Hogan, who has written what you would probably call the definitive book about the work of these guys. The book is called Mapping the Adirondacks, Colvin, Blake, and the First True Survey of the Great Adirondack Wilderness. We actually chatted as part of the Adirondack experiences in the Adirondack Library series. He did a presentation first, which is kind of irrelevant because we don't really have any visuals as part of this podcast.
Right. This is an audio-only podcast.
However, I will say, if you'd like to see the slides that he presented, we'll include a link to the ADKs website where the entire conversation is archived. But the two of us had a great conversation about Colvin and Blake and some of the tools they used and the way they did their work. Yeah, Thatcher Hogan, thanks so much for taking the time.
Hi there.
So Verplanck, Colvin, and Mills Blake were childhood friends. They grew up together. They're working for Colvin's family's law firm. How did they get in the position where they were suddenly doing surveying work?
Yes, Colvin's dad was trying to settle some claims down in the Helderberg Mountains, which is south of Albany. And both Blake and Colvin, I suspect at a very early age, were very comfortable with mathematics. And the school that they went to, the Nassau Academy, was teaching them the basics of surveying, which wouldn't have been too unusual back then, I guess. So they were off in the Helderberg Mountains surveying old property lines for their dad, for Colvin's dad, and got to be quite a team doing that. Used the weekends to explore the caves and everything else down there. Colvin even wrote an article that got picked up by the Harper's Magazine when he's, 23 or something, full of illustrations too. So it was a logical step for them to do surveying, but I don't think they were thinking of it right away. Colvin they both were hired by Colvin's dad to work in his law. And Colvin took time off. I don't think Blake could take time off, but Colvin took time off and went up and visited the Adirondacks when he was right after Civil War, 1865 kind of thing. And he was looking at local maps on Snowy, as a matter of fact, and realized that Snowy didn't exist on any local maps, and thought, well, here's an opportunity maybe, right? So he had been thinking about it from 65 to 72 and being out on his own and doing some rudimentary surveying. And 72 is when he approached the state legislature and said, I wouldn't mind doing this for you. And they said, hey, knock yourself out.
It's funny. I was having a conversation just this afternoon with a college student, an aspiring journalist, who was asking me about the different ways to go into the field. And I meant was to just go out and do it, find a place and start producing or writing stories and trying to sell them. And as I was getting ready for this conversation, it occurred to me that's kind of how Colvin worked his way into the field as well. He just did it and said, will you give me some money to do this?
They gave him $1,000 to complete an Adirondack survey. I mean, it was like, okay, sounds good to me. Once he got that contract, how minimal it was, he turned right around and he hired Blake, who was still working for his dad's law firm. And they never looked back. I just find it amazing being in the Adirondacks. I have a hard time getting to a mountain and getting back into bed at night. And they would stay up until the sun went down, tried to go down the mountains by candlelight so that they could be ready the next morning to do it all over again. They loved it.
Well, do you get the sense that the New York legislature agreed to this just to get rid of him, or
I think they saw no harm in him doing this. He wasn't, he had moderate wealth behind him. He had two older brothers, but he had no family ever, and he was happy to spend his money doing what his passion was. But they certainly weren't expecting him to start publish. They required an annual report. This is the funny part, because they said, okay, we'll give you this money, but you have to give us an annual report at the end of every year. And they said, all right, sounds great. Because this is a guy who had already published something for the Harper's Magazine, right? So it was right up his alley, and he loved to promote himself. So he would spend like 10% of the report would be on what he had surveyed and how important it was for the state. Then the other 90% was like adventures. This is what we did then. Look what happened here. And that's one of the reasons why the reports are so dense. They're fun to read, but sometimes you really need a map in front of you to understand what he's talking about.
well, right. Writing a book like this has to be a little like surveying in its own way. How did you take on this project?
It occurred to me that Colvin had been up a lot of these peaks, so I started reading what he'd said about particular peaks. And then, as I said, I started looking at maps, saying this isn't possible. He's all of a sudden he will show up. His adventure will start by saying, "We would just finished crossing Little Tupper Lake." And he doesn't describe how he ever got to Little Tupper Lake because there weren't roads back then. He just all of a sudden he magically appears, right? And it just was fascinating to me. And then I didn't understand the surveying end of it for quite a while, and until I understood what the right questions were to ask, and I could go looking at his annual reports to find out the answers to them. And I found that fascinating too. Just the idea of traipsing through not just the backpack, but all of the equipment and bringing a crew with you. It amazed me.
We in the 21st century are so used to looking at maps, which are essentially an aerial view from 12 miles up. And we forget that nobody was 12 miles up. They had to do this entirely using math.
Yeah, and he did the shape of lakes. It's unbelievable.
Yeah.
He was actually surveying Lower Saranac Lake by himself, basically, because on a lake you don't need a rodman. You can use a tree on the other side of the lake to focus on and stuff. He was talking about how nasty the waves were at some point on the lake. He could barely get. And I know from canoeing on Lower Saranac Lake, the wind sometimes just will not let you do what you want to do. And he's out there surveying on the lake. It's crazy.
Wow. And I try not to ask a question that I think I already know the answer to, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Do you think you would have been as interested in this material were it not for the nature of who Colvin and Blake were?
Colvin kind of grew on me, and I started to see Blake as an individual by himself much, much later. And and I think I know I got interested in Colvin because of his writings and his annual reports. And if you bring a map, a larger map, and you follow what he's saying, you say, come on, it's not possible because I've canoed across that lake or I've hiked that mountain. We talked about Dick's Mountain. He went from Giant uh, down to Dick's, and then from there went to Nipple Top, and then from there was checking out the gorges between the mountains to see where the waters divided going north or south or east or west, and then hightailed it back to the Beatty Hotel down in Keene Valley. And he did that all in 5 days. And I'm like, no, wait a minute. Because he's got a crew and he's got the surveying equipment and all of that stuff. So it wasn't long before I started following him on a map that I got interested in what he was doing. It would take me a hard time to drive to a lot of those places, right? And again, they're just cutting through the forest to get from one place to another. But what they did was, I just found it fascinating.
How did they deal with no visibility from the majority of peaks?
It is astounding to me that they counted on clear weather. I mean, there are times in his journals that he says he's just totally frustrated with the smoky horizon, right? And we know exactly what he's talking about when he says that. When he had a stretch of really good weather, he would just keep working. He'd camp there and stay up on some peaks for days and days at a time. And he would work into the winter trying to get clear weather. On the peaks that were forested, he would get a hold of the people who owned those peaks. Back then, they were all pretty much privately owned, and ask the permission to let him cut trees so that he could have a full view. Like everybody today, they're going up to a peak to enjoy a view. And his view was critical to being able to finish his work. He had actually very early in a survey, 1873 or 1874, had suggested to the legislature that he build towers, like fire towers, that would be higher than the trees. But he said because of time and the effort of doing that, it wouldn't be economically feasible. But later in his career, he did do that. That's another whole story that I kind of follow in the book. It's the evolution of those things that he was citing on and citing from.
Did Colvin have all the tools he needed to accomplish his work on hand, or did he actually have to invent some of the stuff that he used?
The normal rod, I think, was like 6 to 8 feet at the most. And they invented that taller rod that could flip up to be 12 feet tall. It was about the only way that they could really make some headway on a mountain, or going up, say, by Cascade Lakes when they surveyed up that area. It was steep enough that if you were only using 6-foot high rod, you might disappear in a typical Adirondack dip. Blake wouldn't have been able to see you there. So this taller rod helped a lot. He also, they realized that in order to see another peak that they wanted to focus on, they needed something bright on that peak. And a little spot of light blinking turned out to be the thing that worked really well for 30, 40, 45 miles away. And Blake invented, or I shouldn't say invented, but he improved a little thing that would fit onto a telescope, and it had a mirror on one side and a little sighting thing on the other. And somebody could aim that spot of light back to Colvin on a mountain 20 miles away. The trouble with that was that he had to have numbers of these things. He had to have numbers of woodsmen on those summits doing that maybe all day long until Colvin got a reading there. They invented these huge towers, which were really forerunners of fire towers, because a lot of tourists and stuff started climbing these towers, I think, just to get a better view. And these towers had some rotating tin on the top of them, which would flash in the sunlight, and they wouldn't need to be manned. So he could see them from quite a distance. He was quick to invent things and take credit for it, too.
Well, and that's interesting because you describe Colvin as being very comfortable talking about himself. Blake was a lot more close to the vest.
Yeah, Blake. Well, I think Colvin was just overpowering. If I had to have a dinner party, I wouldn't invite Colvin. I'd invite Blake and probably a few of his guides. And you could probably say, "What's the worst situation you ever found yourself in?" And I just sit back and let them talk and talk and talk. I'm rather more like Blake. I'd much rather have somebody else out front and talking about it all, and me hanging back. Blake really enjoyed being outside, being busy. Really didn't want to be in the public eye at all. Had a very dry sense of humor, though. When he was when the census people came around, when he was living at the Colvin estate, I assume it was him, because I can't imagine anybody else in that household reporting to the census taker that he was the estate's gardener. At one point, he was the estate's coachman. Right? The last census taker to find him when he was, it was 1930, he was in his 80s. He listed his profession as real estate.
Why do you think Colvin and Blake are not better known and have kind of, from whatever notoriety they initially gained from their work?
I don't think Blake would ever be known. I'm hoping to tie his name more closely to Colvin's, because I think he was really integral to the success of the survey. Colvin, I think, was a victim of his own literary flair. He loved to write, loved to speak, and I think he wrote too much. At the end of the day, the state surveyor tried to take all the funds away from Colvin, and the legislature called in a group of professional surveyors to review Colvin's work. And they said that his own reports had biased them into thinking that maybe he was a little more flowery and all of that in his descriptions of what he was doing. And after then reading them and understanding what he was doing, they said his survey work held up to any survey work that even the government was doing. So they were very highly respectful of him, but they didn't go into that thinking that he was going to be as good as he was.
Yeah.
So I think he was a victim of his own exuberance over promoting the Adirondacks. And that's what he's known for today. You run across quotes by Colvin and they're very flowery. The value of solitude among the mountains and the views and stuff like that. Maybe by not being more technical in his annual reports, when the general view of him kind of faded, maybe that's when he faded as well.
Well, Thatcher Hogan, it's just amazing, amazing work that you've done to highlight the amazing work that they did. Thank you so much for sharing it with us.
This is great. Thank you very much. I'm usually a hermit, so you got me out of my cave.
Thatcher Hogan speaking with me as part of the In the Adirondack Library series for the Adirondack Experience, the museum at Blue Mountain Lake. Thatcher is the author of Mapping the Adirondacks, Colvin, Blake, and the First True Survey of the Great Adirondack Wilderness. Ethan Shanty, if you're not hiking right now, could you fill us in with the names of the people that make this show possible?
Recorded live from the high peaks of the NCPR studio, Northwards is an NCPR podcast production. The show is written, produced, and edited by Mitch Tyke with digital production supervision by me. I'm Ethan Shanty. You can find out more about this program, listen to past episodes at ncpr.org/northwards. Our theme music is by the Wickmore Jazz Trio of Plattsburgh. This is NCPR North Country Public Radio.
Belay!